Shalom and salam. Welcome to 1 Kings chapter 17. There are 24 verses in this chapter. Beginning in verse 1, we see an important fact that has been revealed finally in the Septuagint of all places. It is only revealed here that Elijah is not only a Tishbite, we know that already, but he comes from a place called Thesba. Thesba or Thesbe. I'm going to say Thesbe. That's how people would pronounce it nowadays, Thesbe. Maybe it is Thesbe, maybe it's Thesba, maybe it's Thesba. Thesba, or Thes. In any case, but that's the place where he comes from, and it is located in Gilead. Verses of the inhabitants, so we can see it is masked where he's from in the Masoretic. Okay, there's an omission of God of hosts. And then it says here, except by the word of my mouth, verses according to my word. So the Septuagint is saying Elijah can speak rain into existence, versus there will not be rain, according to what I said. Verse 5, he sat versus he dwelt by the brook. Verse 6, a significant difference. And anyone who is obsessed with food or obsessed with details like myself, and food is important to you, you will make sure to mention this. It's the following. The ravens brought Elijah. In the morning, they would bring him breakfast. What was it? Just bread, loaves. What did they bring him in the Masoretic text? They brought him bread and meat in the morning for breakfast. And then, in the evening for supper time, he's eating meat again. That's not a healthy diet. Notice as well, he's eating twice a day. He's not eating 3 round meals. Perhaps 2 meals a day is what we should be doing. But in any case, in the Septuagint, he is also eating meat, but only in the evening, only for supper, not in the morning, which seems to make sense because meat tends to make people more drowsy. For instance, tryptophan, which is an ingredient. It's one of the constituents of chicken and turkey, for example. So it's one of the ingredients of meat, tryptophan, and so maybe that helps with that in that regard. Next is verse 7. It says here, earth, in both translations. So it's interesting, or it is noteworthy, that earth does not mean a planet, no rain upon the earth, but only rain on the land. So earth means land, and in this case, the land of Israel, or Gilead specifically. So that's verse 7. Verse 10 and 11, we're going to see a common difference, a continuous difference, I should say. Continuous difference in both 10 and 11. And it is the rendering of the word cried after her, also meaning called to her. And it takes discernment to recognize which one it is. So in verse 11, we see here that Elijah cried after her after she went to fetch the water in the vessel. So is she far enough to warrant him, Elijah or Eliyahu? Is it far enough for him to yell at her and cry after her? Because that is what is implied when you're crying. Not crying as in weeping, but crying as in calling out in a loud manner. We're going to see another verse that gives us a little more maybe wisdom a little more information as to when to apply wisdom and understand it as such. So in this case, I would interpret this verse as not being cried as in shouted or yelling, but that he simply called to her. So I'm going to give the Masoretic text the benefit of the doubt here and say this actually makes a little more sense. That it is called, not so much cried as in yelling. Verse 12, we can see that, again, more common sense being applied here. The woman has a handful of meal left, and it is contained in a pitcher which would contain a handful of food. But if she has a barrel, which can be very large, oftentimes barrels can be as tall as 3 feet tall, maybe taller, and minimum 2 feet wide. And a handful of food being placed in a barrel just does not make sense. How do you retrieve that food out of the barrel? It makes more sense for it to be contained in a pitcher rather than a barrel. So that's verse 12. And then we see, continuing down verse 12, it says, my children versus my son. So it seems she has more than just one son, according to this verse. And then it says in the same verse, last, that's verse 13. Okay, verse 13. Be of good courage is Elijah's encouraging statement versus fear not. So one is more negative, referring to fear. The other one is telling her to be of good courage. Cheer up, be brave. Look on the bright side of life. Continuous difference is children versus son again. And then we see last. You shall make the cake for yourself and your children last versus you shall make the cake after. So we can see an order of how things are instructed by Elijah to the woman. He said, bring to him the little cake first to me. So do this for me first. And then you shall make for yourself the cake and for you and your children last. So that's the order of things. We see that too in the Masoretic. It's just a little more explicit that as to who's taking priority here. It's Elijah. In the Masoretic, it can be taken as the actions are being done in an order. But no, we see the individuals are prioritized either first or last. In the Masoretic, it's not so much that the language is focusing on Elijah per se, and even the woman and her son, or children, I should say, but it's talking about the actions that must be taken. So make a cake first, and then make a cake for you and your son last. So that's verse 13. Verse 14, talking about the supplies, the food supplies she has, the rations. The pitcher of meal shall not fail versus shall not waste. So that is a pretty interesting difference. When a supply fails, you've run out, but when you waste, it means you're throwing it out. So I'm going to mark this as a significant difference. So that's fail versus waste. Again, we see similar language used regarding the oil, not just the bread itself, but the oil shall not diminish, so shall not lower. But interestingly enough, the word fail means the same thing. It can mean the same thing according to the footnotes. Diminish can mean also fail, and fail can mean diminish. Verse 15, her children versus her house. So referring to the children specifically, not just anyone in her household. And there's an addition of many days. he did eat. Verse 18, sins versus sin. Verse 19, told him, or I should say laid him. So Elijah is laying him on the bed. The footnote reads, caused him to sleep. Verse 20, cried aloud versus cried. So this is the difference maker. So we read earlier in this chapter that cried versus called, but the word that differentiates that one being called versus one crying out loud is the word aloud, which we see cried aloud. So that is more specific to the volume of the voice. So the aloud portion of this text, of this verse, emphasizes that this is more certain. It is more certain that one is crying out loud, or the character is crying out loud. In this case, Elijah, rather than just calling, simply calling, or another word being used as a substitute. For example, fighting off a donkey, for example. So calling, or another word that is used, we will see, instead of cried aloud or cried, we will see the words lighting off. So she lighted off her donkey. That can be substituted with cried aloud, or even cried, and the opposite is true. Cried aloud can be substituted with lighting off. So that verb, that action of lighting off, getting off a donkey, debarking, or getting off the saddle. Okay, next is verse 20. We're continuing on verse 20. So we see here, alas, was omitted. Another omission is the witness of the widow with whom I sojourn. Thou hast wrought evil. So possibly this could be a question, because again, punctuation did not exist in the original text. So if we read this a different way and we move hast before thou, it becomes, O Lord, the witness of the widow with whom I sojourn, have you worked evil in slaying her son? So it could be rendered that way, or understood that way, versus have you also brought evil upon the widow, which is similar, but it is more clear in the Masoretic that, at least via the translator, that it is a question being asked. Verse 21, this is a big difference, our first one of the chapter. And this is regarding what Elijah did. What did his actions consist of? Well, in the mainstream reading of this verse, many people understand it as Elijah stretching himself on the child, which can be misinterpreted in many ways. Some people could say, okay, that's CPR. He's stretching his arms out, or he's holding his hands, in whatever way that can be interpreted. It can be muddied. It can be framed in the wrong way. In the Septuagint, it is straightforward. Yes, it still relates to CPR, but it's saying here he breathed on the child. Breathing on the child means you are putting your air into his nostrils or his mouth. You are resuscitating him. That is known in modern day as CPR. Verse 22. And it was so, and the child cried out. So after Elijah prayed, it came true right away. The child cried out. In the Masoretic, it says, and Adonai heard the voice of Elijah, and the soul of the child came into him again. So it's worded differently, much differently, but the same thing happens. The same result occurs. Okay, so that's verse 22. He sat, or I should say, and the soul of the child came into him again, and he revived. Okay, verse 24, the last verse of this chapter, it says here, "Behold, I know that you are a man of God," versus, "Now by this I know that you are a man of God." So the woman is saying, "Look, I know you are a man of God," versus, "Now you've proven yourself to me," in the Masoretic. "And the word of Adonai in your mouth is true." So she knows that now, versus that the word of Adonai in your mouth is truth. So that's all for this chapter, 1 Kings 17. Thank you very much for your time. Till next time, I bid you all shalom, salam, and maranatha.